at the final installment of Poems That Changed Me. An entire year, the 50-second video, one each week, in which I talk about transformative poems. I actually can't believe that the year is over. I can't believe that I actually did this. I can't believe that you actually watched. It's really rather remarkable. I have to say I'm a little bit relieved that this is my final video. Although, as many of you know, this series is going to continue in 2022, but with actual, important, interesting poets, not me. I'm a little sad that I don't have the opportunity ahead of me to think about transformative poems in terms of a project. I think about transformative poems every day, of course, but there was something about thinking about the kinds of poems I wanted to do this week or the upcoming week that really made me think differently about poetry and about what sort of things were transformative for me. I thought probably about more than anything what I would end with. A couple of people asked me if I would end with one of my own poems that was transformative for me, but I'm not really interested in that. Maybe ending with the very first poem that I read, but I don't have any idea what that is. And instead, I actually am cheating. I'm going to talk about 3 poems that were transformative for me. And these are 3 of the final poems that Wallace Stevens wrote. I wrote my MA thesis and my PhD dissertation on Wallace Stevens. I was obsessed with him for a long time. Over the last few years, his stance on race has made me rethink my devotion to him and his manner of thinking. But I am still amazed by the work he's able to do. And in some ways, the complexity of his thought and its contradictions has made his accomplishments with language even more beguiling in some ways, certainly more complex and more nuanced. Greatness is complicated. Transformation is complicated. One of the things I like about these poems is I feel, and I acknowledge that this is probably a hopeful reading or an optimistic reading, but I feel like these poems evince a kind of transformation on the part of Stevens. Stevens, as many viewers know, spent the early part of his career really immersed in the kind of pyrotechnics of language, questioning many things, religion, the establishment. His poems are often very abstract, very aloof, impenetrable, considered solipsistic, self-absorbed, very inward-looking, and not particularly generous. I feel like that changed a little bit during the middle period. I think there are some phenomenally important poems like Of Modern Poetry, and of course I talk about The Man on the Dump earlier in the year. But these poems, they come toward the end of his book, The Rock, which was posthumously published. These are some of the final poems that Stevens wrote. And I remember coming upon these for the first time and really being transformed by them. They felt new, they felt different, they felt more sophisticated. They felt less to me like he was trying to impress readers or impress the T.S. Eliots of the world or the literary critics of the world, and rather he was, I hate this phrase so much, but I'm going to use it because it's the end of the year and the end of this project, because writing from the heart. And I think writing with his ear, and the ear that's in the heart and the heart that's in the ear. These poems are really interesting to me for a number of reasons. One, all 3 are written in tercets, 3-line stanzas. my sense is he really liked the three-line stanza, maybe because it evoked Dante. But I have this theory, it's a ridiculous theory that cannot be proven, but that each of the three-line stanzas creates a kind of trinity, a trifecta, a triumvirate between the author, the reader, and the poem. So there is this triangle that happens in each stanza, the poet, the reader, and the poem. I feel like there is this meeting place, this triangle, and that all three sides of those get re-encoded in each of these tercets. And I love that. Secondly, Stevens just drops the mask a little bit here. He is way more interested in connection and association and some sort of union than he is in distancing. I feel like some of his early poems like Snowman or To a High-Toned Old Christian Woman or Poetry is a Destructive Force or 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. These poems are really all about aloofness and distance and keeping the reader and emotions and desire kind of at a distance. But in these poems, I see things going in a new direction. Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour, I remember seeing James Merrill say that this poem is for him. He feels about this poem the way many people feel about the 23rd Psalm. And I have to agree with him. This poem is absolutely gorgeous to me. I think about lines of this poem toward the end when I'm on a plane and I'm scared, or I'm lonely, or someone I love has died. How high the highest candle lights the dark. We say God and the imagination are one. This notion of being here together is enough. Stevens spent most of his poetic life asking what will suffice? What will be enough? What will make the best poem? What will make the greatest statement? And here he seems to be saying just being together here is enough. Also, the sort of notion of poverty, the shawl wrapped around us because we are poor, this notion of not having much, either enough imagination, enough recognition, enough language, the ineffability of life itself, something about him struggling, coming up short, is really interesting and attractive and warming for me. The World is Meditation is such a weird poem. In this poem, Stevens seems to be writing from the perspective of Penelope, Odysseus's wife that is waiting for his return. And I'm fascinated by this stance of waiting, rather than sort of write from the perspective of Odysseus, who's conquering the world and slaying villains and sleeping with a lot of women. Stevens instead seems to associate or align himself with Penelope, the female, the less masculine of the characters, in this position of waiting, as though he's waiting for inspiration or God or the muse, something. This notion of composing the self, the composition of poetry, he seems to be suggesting that the poet, rather than this kind of hyper-masculine, hyper-aggressive, certain persona that you see in the first few books, he's now seeming to suggest is in a position of subservience, of abeyance, of dependence. And I find this really interesting and very accommodating, that he would choose in his final poems to suggest perhaps that the act of writing, the act of poetry, is really just an act of waiting, not of control, but of giving up of control, of not of dominance, but of cooperation, indeterminacy. This is a poem of indeterminacy. The Planet on the Table, I feel like, is a poem that changed my life. One of the very last poems Stevens wrote. Again, a very interesting decision to deploy the persona of Ariel, you can think about Ariel from Shakespeare's The Tempest in interesting ways. The poet, Stevens, could have and perhaps might have been attracted to the idea of casting himself as Prospero, someone who speaks and can speak the world into being. Or Caliban, this sort of dangerous, provocative figure from the underworld. But instead, to talk about his life as a poet, he chooses Ariel, the more androgynous, least masculine, imprisoned character from The Tempest. Ariel was glad he had written his poems. I have always wondered what prompted Stevens, one, to feel more aligned with Penelope than Odysseus, and to feel more aligned with Ariel than Caliban, or especially Prospero. But this claim at the end that the poems were as much a part of him as the world in which they are part, like the world is his poem. His poems, it is not important that the poems survive. That really blew me away, because I feel like most poets, especially someone like Shakespeare, has basically argued for his immortality through art. And Stevens, who spent his entire life, I think, committed to the project of creating a poetics that would endure, is finally saying it's really not important that they survive. What's important is that they bear some lineament or character, some essence of the world of which they are part. Doesn't matter if you read this down the road or if this goes into the dustbin of history, but rather that in their communicating, they reflect the world, that they're part of the world, which seems to me to be a great reversal of the earlier Stevens, who was largely about abstraction, right? Pulling away from the world, or solipsism, sort of returning to the self, or retreating to the self even, but rather the sense of the poems being part and parcel of us, of the world. Coming across these three poems, themselves a kind of trifecta of brilliance, changed how I thought about importance or greatness or the efficacy of poetry, because they weren't trying hard to bowl me over or to impress me, but rather they seemed to be, after a life of one kind of writing, seemed to be just exhaling and welcoming me in. And I feel like poetry at its best is welcoming. It's an invitation to come in. You don't have to understand it. You don't even have to like it, but it's an invitation. It's a welcoming. And I'd spent many years struggling with Stevens, being impressed by him, but not really feeling welcomed by him. And these three poems, written late in his life, something about the way they looked on the page, the context with which they were presented in the rock, and just their tone of somewhere between an invitation and a prayer did something for me and changed really something deep within me. That's it. That's all I got. 2021, 52 poems, all for you. I can't tell you how excited I am for the next year and what lies ahead. But for all of us here at the headquarters of Poems That Changed Me, thank you very much for your attention and your commitment to poetry. And I wish you a blessed and safe and, my God, a transformative 2022.